Hey, if you haven't done so already, can you please make sure to fill out the survey that is provided in the show notes? You can go to theresearchher.com/survey for quick access, but please fill out the survey so I can learn more about you. And the link to that is also in the show notes. Okay, let's get to the episode. Thank you so much for joining us here at The Research Her, the show working to improve the health disparities for women of color, one topic at a time. I am Elissia. I'm here learning and growing with you as we research our way to well-being. I am so excited to bring to you all our great sis, McKenzie Stokes, who is a first-generation college graduate from Virginia Commonwealth University. There, she studied psychology and African American studies. McKenzie is now a doctor of applied social and community psychology candidate at North Carolina State University. Her research examines the roles of race-based protective factors, race-based risk factors, and parent-child relationships on the well-being of racially marginalized adolescents. She specifically hopes to disrupt narratives of racial essentialism in this work and the world more generally. Without further ado, let's talk to our great sis, McKenzie Stokes. So, yes, let's get started. I like to start off with icebreaker questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
So my first question is, who are Black women researchers who inspire you?
Off the top of my head, I really think my advisor first, Dr. Elan Hope, Dr. Qiana Cryer-Coupet, who does fatherhood research, and then Kimberlé Crenshaw, who does a lot of intersectionality theory work.
And if you could break the law one time, what would you do?
I think I would probably hack into the criminal justice system and expunge the records of people who have really petty charges that inhibit them from doing things that they want to do.
Mm-hmm. And what is an unpopular opinion that you have?
I'd rather be hot than cold.
That's me too. I feel that. I really feel that. So I don't know how unpopular it is over here. When did you realize that you wanted to pursue a doctoral degree?
That would have to be the middle of my junior year of undergrad. Throughout my undergrad career, I had been doing research, and a lot of it was more from a social or a health perspective. So looking at things like health disparities, particularly among different racial groups. And I was interested in it, but I really wanted to make sure the research that I ended up doing later on would be applied to actually impact people, in a really intentional way. So not just published in journals that people can't access, but make intervention and prevention programs based on the work that I would do. And so applied psychology just felt like the perfect way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about when you decided that you were going to pursue your doctoral degree. What was it that was that, aha, yes, I'm going to do this?
Yeah, it's so funny because my first year in school, I'm a first-gen college grad. And so my first year in school, I had no idea what I wanted to do at all. And a mentor looked at me and he was like, "You're going to get your PhD in psychology." And I looked at him like, "You have no idea who you're talking to. I'm not going to do that." But I started to do research throughout really my whole career in undergrad. And then I got into a summer research program at the University of Virginia that was 8 weeks long. And it was really designed to encourage people from underrepresented groups to go into PhD programs. And in the midst of that program, I realized I want a PhD too. And so that's when I decided to really competitively pursue it right after undergrad.
And were there any challenges that you faced specifically because you are a Black woman in psychology?
I didn't start to notice the challenges that I would experience as a Black woman in psychology until I got to grad school, especially around being a student in class with other people and teaching. So I've been teaching for about 4 semesters, and I definitely noticed that my students are a lot, it feels like, at least I'll say, are a lot more critical of me as a young Black woman.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the process of getting into your current field of research and picking your research group.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I started out just working on a lot of different research studies, but they all kind of looked at some type of social inequality or racial inequality. And so I knew I was definitely passionate and interested in it. And so after I kind of learned what research was, I started to think about the questions that I would want to answer with research methods. And so I really started to think about my own experiences as somebody that was raised in a single parent home and who has a sister that has a mental illness, and just started to think, like, why was that the case? What caused that? So then I looked in the literature and found that people were actually studying things like race impacts your well-being and families matter for your psychological health. So then I was like, I want to do research like that too. And that's kind of how I got to this area.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the topics that you're currently investigating?
Yeah, so currently in grad school, I'll kind of give the terms, but I can explain them. I look at racial socialization, racial identity, and mental health, really looking more so at depression right now, or depressive symptoms.
You are looking at so many different topics. How do you keep up with so much literature in so many different areas?
Yeah, this is a question that I was asked recently, actually, and I'm like, how do I? I think part of it is writing a lot, because if I'm writing a lot, I'm typically checking back to see the most recent literature to see if I can update my citations or if there's any new studies that speak to some of the gaps that I talk about in my own work. And so I think writing always keeps me back in the literature. I also recently started to really utilize the internet. So Google Scholar can give you alerts for research that is similar to your own interests. And that has been really helpful too, as it just if I see a title that pops up in my email that is interesting, I'll go and save the PDF. And so I feel like those are the main ways that I stay in the literature, but I definitely can improve on that as well.
Mm-hmm. So tell us, what is racial socialization?
Yes. The purest way to say it is essentially it's the way that parents teach their kids about race. So I look at it in Black people. So I like to say even more specifically, it's the way that Black parents teach their kids about Black people and about being Black. And that can be through verbal messages, is really popular kind of in pop media is the talk about racial violence, but it can also be through nonverbal behaviors, like going to the beauty supply store with your mom or going to a Black church. All of those things teach a Black person about Black people, about Black culture, and about what it means to be a Black person, particularly in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So does it only have to be your parents that's teaching you, or is this specific term geared towards parents teaching?
So it really can be any kind of agent. So right now in the literature, we know that parents are a primary agent of racial socialization, meaning they really first teach their kids about race. But there are so many other agents of racial socialization. Like during the teenage years, your friends become really important, right? So you learn about race from them. You learn about it from the media, what you read.
School?
Yeah, definitely in school, from your teachers, again, your peers become a huge influence. And then also, I think the media is a really important one too, especially with everything that goes on nowadays. If you witness a video or you hear about a video of a Black person being harmed by the police, that's a form of racial socialization. It's teaching you that something about being Black puts you in danger, right? And so all of those things, basically anything that teaches a child about what it means to be Black is racial socialization. Then you just got to look at the different forms that are out there.
Mm-hmm. And some of your work is geared towards gendered racial socialization. Can you talk a little bit more about what is gender racial socialization?
Yes. So it's basically a newer kind of concept in the field, but it's similar to racial communication, right? So we just talked about racial socialization being the ways that I'm talking particularly about parental racial socialization, because that's what my work looks at, right? So thinking about the way that Black parents teach their kids about being Black, gendered racial socialization within my work is looking specifically at the way that Black parents teach their daughters about what it means to be Black and a woman, or particularly Black and a young girl. So those messages could really be things like, you should be proud to be a Black woman, right? So celebrating Black girls for their hair, or telling them that like brown skin is beautiful. But it can also consist of like more negative messages that people might hear, like, Black women always have bad attitudes, or even things, like, don't wear your natural hair out, or why is your hair like that? So those are also things that teach Black girls about what it means to be a Black woman, not just being Black, because they're different. So I think that's a big contribution that gendered racial socialization brings to the psychological research, is that it goes beyond thinking of Black women as just Black.
Mm-hmm. So what about, does it go in another direction where gendered racial socialization can be referred to like how people teach their young boys what it is to be a Black man as well? Or is this specific to just being a Black woman? And is it applied to other races as well, I guess? So what do parents teach their kids about being a young white boy or a young Pakistani boy or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like in terms of the first question, gendered racial socialization, in the way that it's rooted in intersectionality theory, which was, of course, coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw, which was designed for Black girls and Black women, which I think is important to kind of remember when we're thinking about the roots of gendered racial socialization right now. Essentially, intersectionality theory, in case people don't know, is this idea that the experiences of Black women are influenced by their intersecting marginalized positions of both their race and their gender. She really coined this term to like bring attention to the fact that Black women are left out of conversations at a national level and out of even like movements of resistance, like anti-racism. And so I think some of the racial socialization messages that we look at are kind of rooted in this idea of intersectionality. But with that said, I'm sure there is not a scale yet actually created that measures it for Black boys. But just like Black parents deliver specific messages to their Black daughters based on the intersections of their race and gender, I could absolutely say that I'm sure Black parents are doing that for their sons as well. And then for your second question, yes, every racial ethnic group practices racial socialization, right? So white parents, even if they're not verbally talking to their kids about race, they're teaching them about what it means to be white. And they're also teaching them about other racial groups, even by the way that they treat them.
Why is there such a lack of research surrounding the intersectionality of being both Black and woman?
Yes, that's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, and I'm thinking really about psychological research, is that it's rooted still within a patriarchal structure. And then also, like, for a long time, it was dominated by men. So even like the work that I do, like racial socialization and racial identity, those concepts, particularly racial identity, were first studied and kind of trailblazed by Black men. And so I think for a long time, the thought of like, well, is this different for Black women, or what is the intersection of this? What's the significance of that? I don't think it occurred at the time that these kind of things were first developed. And so over time, I think the field started to recognize that gender was important, but instead they just looked at things like what was different, like, do Black girls have different outcomes if they hear different messages than Black boys? But they didn't necessarily consider like the actual personal experience of being a Black woman until recently. And so I think part of it, again, is that it's just a patriarchal society, and like we have to remember that disciplines exist within that. They're influenced by that. And then I also think within psychology, there just isn't a lot of space for the idea that people have multiple identities. There isn't a lot of measures that assess that, just beyond kind of the racial social work.
Yes, you're speaking on racial identity. What is racial identity, and how does it relate back to racial socialization? Yes,
and so I feel like the most straightforward way to talk about racial identity is basically like for a Black person, again, because that's what my work is looking at, like, how do you feel about being Black, and what does it mean to you? And also, like, what is the significance you attach to it? So some of the questions that we use to assess racial identity in the work is, are you proud to be Black? And, like, how central is it to your identity? And then also kind of beyond that is looking at how do you think other people view your racial group? So it's all of these things that kind of impact your own identity and how you see yourself and how you think other people see you based on your race. And then in terms of how socialization relates to it, we know that the messages that parents send to their kids about their race impacts how they feel about it, right? And so if your mom or your dad is telling you frequently to be proud of being Black, the literature shows that you're more likely to be proud that you're Black, which is an important piece of your racial identity.
Yeah, and let's keep talking about that. So does it matter whether it's your mom or your dad? How do the messages that are received by youth, specifically girls, impact them maybe long-term or short-term, or how they show up in the world?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. A lot of work has not thoroughly examined if messages are more important or more like impactful on Black people if they come from their mom or their dad. I know in a study that we just did and resubmitted, the Black girls reported hearing more positive messages about Black women specifically if they were closer to their moms. And that was not the case for if they were close with their dads. And so that says something to the idea that racial communication or racial socialization exists within a broader family system. And so how close you feel to your mom or your dad is also going to impact how frequently you talk with them, right? Especially for adolescents and teenagers. And so while we, in that study, were not able to determine whether the messages were more important if they came from their mom or their dad, we were able to determine that it was at least impacted by how close they felt with their mom. And that was only for the gendered racial socialization piece, which then further shows that there is a difference between general messages and gendered messages. And if they come from your mom and you feel close with your mom, they may be a little bit more salient than your dad.
What are some of the messages that these girls would receive?
Yeah, so in the study, again, we looked at non-gendered, I'll call it, forms of racial socialization. And we took a positive kind of lens to this. And so we were looking at pride. So we asked them to report how frequently their mom told them things or their dad told them things like, you should be proud to be Black, or Black people do great things in the world. And then for the gendered piece, we looked at two kind of similar dimensions. So the first one was messages like, you should be proud to be a Black woman, you know, Black women are strong. So how frequently they heard messages like that. And we also looked on the other end to see how frequently they heard messages like Black women have bad attitudes or lighter skin is prettier than dark skin.
If they were receiving more negative messages from their primary caregiver, what was the result of that?
Yes. And so Black girls who reported hearing more of those negative messages actually reported experiencing more depressive symptoms than Black girls who did not. And they were also reporting that they felt less proud to be Black. And so that was a key piece as well.
And did that result in any mental health issues for the girls?
Yes. And so we found that girls who felt more proud to be Black and really felt that Black was important to their identity, we found that they also reported fewer depressive symptoms. And what that means is that racial identity or celebrating one's racial group works as a protective factor for Black girls, meaning that those feelings are really beneficial and they can decrease the risk of experiencing severe mental health outcomes.
And so what are some of those depressive symptoms that you all studied?
So we used items from a scale called the DAS-21, and it looks more so at the emotional part of depression. And so some of the items were things like if they felt that life was meaningless, or if they felt like they weren't worth much as a person, or had nothing to look forward to. And so they were asked to report on if they experienced those emotions over the past week and how frequently they did so.
Are studies like this done for multicultural youth?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. So part of my work moving forward is looking at multiracial youth and families, because when I began doing this research, I realized that they're really not talked about much. And so in terms of your question, like, is the work done with multiracial youth? Not really. Of course, there is some more theoretical research that says, like, it's really important because these are still people who are Black, and we know that multiracial people experience similar forms of discrimination that Black people experience because they're perceived as Black by white people, right? But they also experience other like stressors related to being a person that has multiple racial identities in a society that likes to enforce strict color lines, right, due to our history. And so multiracial people, and I'm multiracial, so like I speak from the literature and also my own experiences, we know that there are unique forms of discrimination that multiracial youth face as well. And so the way that parents talk to their kids about race also impacts how they understand discrimination and how they respond to it. And so it's going to be super important for multiracial youth too, but the research really just hasn't gotten there yet.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who is multiracial, do you have a desire to dive into that field or that area of discovery?
I like that, in the area of discovery. Yeah, so my dissertation is actually looking at racial socialization in multiracial Black-white families. And so I'm actually designing a scale, which is like really important in psychological research, to be able to measure the ways that Black parents are and white parents are talking to their multiracial youth about their race. So I just did interviews with about 20 biracial teenagers, and that was really fun. So I'm excited for that work.
Nice. I just want to go back to where you said the closeness to the mother mattered for your racial identity, right? So for your particular study, did you care whether their mother was one race versus another race?
For this study, the only thing we required was that either their mom or their dad was Black or white. So I was actually really interested in getting participants who had a Black mom and a white dad because they're less talked about in the research. So a lot of the research on multiracial like families is done from the perspective of white women, particularly white moms, because they're the ones that are doing the work. And so I feel like in my work, I really want to make sure that we're inclusive of people who come from Black moms and white dads, as well as like I hope to expand beyond just Black white people, like the entire multiracial population.
When I think about research related to Black women as a whole, there is such a hole in like discovering these different things about Black women who are Black women. Let's not even get to the point where we're trying to actually talk about people who have multiple identities. If we aren't represented in academia to start off, as graduate students or as undergraduates, then graduate students, then postdocs, and then going and becoming professors, I just don't think that the research will ever be done.
No, it won't. And it's not going to be done in a way that's right, in a way that's true. It's going to be comparative, like, Black people compared to white people rather than on the actual experiences of a group. And so I definitely agree that representation in the field is so important. And think about intersectionality, like in the work that we're talking about from like my study, like that's just looking at two identities. It's looking at race and gender, but we all know like people are so much more complex than that. Like what like background did you come from? What religion do you practice? Do you practice one? Like there's so many other facets of people's identities. And I feel like that's what I want my work to continue to capture, like keep going. If you feel like you've gotten enough like of their identity, if you feel like you think you know enough, like there's always more.
Yeah. And even when I think about like my limited beliefs in what Black looks like. So for me, I just think if the two people who had sex and produced you, if one of them is Black, you Black. Like that's my very limited belief in what Black means. But that doesn't always mean that the person who's coming out identifies as being like a Black person. I know people who are like, well, no, they're X, Y, and Z. And we all have our very limited beliefs in what Black looks like. But again, going back to what your research is about, it's about like racial identity. So it's how that person perceives themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's an important point for like multiracial people and Black people who don't align with what other people think Black is. Like I studied African American studies in undergrad, And the ways my professors introduced these concepts, I finally understood it and got it. I'm like, Blackness isn't in a box. If you do these things, you're Black. No, you're Black, and however you see yourself as Black, that's your racial identity. But there's work that shows other people questioning your Blackness, for people who don't have a white parent and a Black parent, and for multiracial people, is psychologically traumatic. For somebody to say, like, you're not Black enough to these people, or, you know, like, it's more common to be like, oh, you're an Oreo, you know, like that's like the more, you know, like in the street kind of thing, like that's what gets said, but it's the same accusation. It's that you're not Black enough, you know? And so we know that, like, in the psychological research, we know that, like, that can be traumatic. And so through my work, I feel like another piece that I try to look at is, how do we stop that perspective, and how do we help parents raise their kids to understand that Blackness can't be put in a box, and so they don't have to kind of either be a perpetrator of that or feel like they're not Black enough when they grow up and go in different spaces.
What have you learned about how racial identity is experienced for those college-age students, particularly at PWIs?
Yeah, I love that question. So my first couple of research studies that I did when I got to grad school were looking at Black students at PWIs, because that's the data that my advisor had. And what we found was that Black students who, again, had positive attitudes about being Black and felt positively about other Black people, right? So not just I'm happy to be Black, but like I love other Black people too. We found that those students were reporting less depressive symptoms and less anxiety symptoms, particularly in their first year. So when they transition to college, which can be really hard for everybody, including Black people. And so I think that's an important mechanism for how we can help promote well-being among those students.
Mm-hmm. So what are those depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms that were accounted for in the study?
Yeah, so those ones were a little bit different. We still accounted for some of the emotional sides of depression, like feeling hopeless about the future. But I also, like, in that study, we looked at things even like appetite. So if they had poor appetite, and kind of the combination of those things over the past 2 weeks.
And what is different between what you accounted for depression and what you accounted for anxiety?
Yeah, so the biggest difference was that we looked at anxiety over the past 6 months, rather than depression over the past week or 2 weeks. And then anxiety looked at things like if they can't stop worrying about what's going on in their lives, or even difficulty concentrating due to so much worrying.
And did it matter for these college-age students whether they were close to their parents?
Yeah, it was an interesting study. So we did find that for students who were closer to their moms, that feeling more positively about being Black was strongerly associated with depression. So what that means, kind of in a lay term, is that for students who were proud to be Black, and if they felt closer to their moms, they were the least likely to report being depressed. And so that kind of showed us that it's not just one or the other, right? So it's not just if you feel close to your mom, you're less likely to be depressed, but it's also for Black people, like if you feel closer to your parents and you feel really proud to be Black and you hold positive feelings about being Black, those together contribute to better mental health.
Mm-hmm. And do you see yourself doing any future studies in this field? What would you like to see yourself do?
Yeah, I definitely see myself continuing to do this work. I think more so with teenagers. I just really enjoy that population and understanding how we can instill positivity about being Black during that period, because like that's when you really begin to shape your identity. Like it's always going to change, but you know, developmental research shows during your teenage years, so around like 13 to 16, 17 is really when you start to understand who you are in the world. So I definitely want to continue to work with that population and do research that looks at how Black parents and parents of multiracial Black kids can help them develop these attitudes that can decrease their risk of psychological distress, because there are a lot of mental health disparities faced by Black youth and multiracial youth specifically. And so I really want to continue to do work that can kind of reduce the risk of those.
Mm-hmm. And what research are you not going to do that you wish were done?
Ooh, that's a good question. What am I not going to do? After I conducted my interviews, again, I interviewed about 20 biracial teenagers. So they had one Black parent and one white parent this summer. And I was so excited to see that overwhelmingly majority of the sample of the 20 kids, they did not identify as heterosexual. So they identified as just like all over the board. So it was not just man or woman, right? So a lot of them identified as non-binary and some as transgender. And this is not usually the case for like an adolescent sample randomly. And so I was really excited to see that. I was able to talk with them more about it. And a lot of the biracial kids were saying, I already navigate multiple racial identities. Why can't I navigate different sexual identities as well as like a different sexual orientation if I want to? But it falls a little bit outside of my research and my expertise. And so I think that is definitely studies and like a whole body of research that should be examined, right? Like how does already having a multiple racial identity impact sexual orientation over development? I think that should definitely be conducted and further explored.
If we want to connect with you after this episode, how can we do so?
Yes, you can go to my Instagram. It is at Becoming Dr. Stokes, and I'd be happy to connect with you.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to contact me, I am at theresearcher.com. You can also reach me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at theresearcher. And until next time, I holla.